Paul Taggart, and I'm joined by Aleks Szczerbiak, and we are here just to talk about an article that we published in 2018 called Putting Brexit into Perspective. And in this article, Aleks and I built on a lot of work that we've done in the past about the nature and the scale and the scope of Euroscepticism. And we asked ourselves the question about what the role of the crises that we were seeing at the time, how they had impacted on Euroscepticism. And we were particularly interested in the three crises that we were most salient in that period. First of all, we were interested in the Euro crisis and the larger economic crisis that came from 2008, 2009 onwards. Secondly, we were interested in the impact of the migration crisis that came in 2015. And thirdly, we were particularly interested to see, in the light of Brexit, whether that constituted a crisis that might also have the same sort of implications that the previous two crises had. So we looked at the question of what sort of effect different crises had on the way that political parties expressed Euroscepticism.
The method that we used was an expert survey. We asked leading specialists on party politics and party Euroscepticism in every EU member state and some non-EU member states what the impact of those three crises has been on Euroscepticism in their party systems. We did 2 rounds of questions, one in 2015 and one in 2017. And these people are real experts in party politics and in Euroscepticism in their countries. Some of these people we've worked with for more than 20 years in trying to gather data, so they really knew what they were talking about and had real expertise in their cases.
These expert surveys, we then collated and looked through the responses, and what these are essentially, as Aleks said, the judgments, but also kind of the assessment of the situation by these experts. And we in a sense distilled these into a number of findings. Looking across the cases, we looked at 2 different things primarily. First of all, we looked at how is it that the opposition to European integration, Euroscepticism, how is it manifested in these different countries? What issues does it attach to, and what sort of themes are expressed by the parties that express Euroscepticism? Looking across the ranges of parties and cases that we looked at, we saw there essentially were 4 clusters of what we called frames in which Euroscepticism was set. The first of these were economic frames, the sense that European integration was not economically advantaging particular countries, and obviously this was very salient for the Euro crisis, but it also came out through the other crises. But very often the critique of Europe was about its effects on economic success. The second frame was that of immigration, and the sense of immigration being an issue that's not being well dealt with by the European Union, or that indeed that issues of immigration and free movement was itself a problem for particular member states. Now, just like the economic factor, these factors manifest themselves in slightly different ways in different countries, but they definitely formed a cluster. The third set of issues we put together as democracy and sovereignty. These were critiques of the EU for not being democratic, and critiques of the EU for compromising national sovereignty. Now, the 2 are not the same. The 2 are very different critiques of the EU, but they often combine. And it seemed to us this represented a kind of clustering of issues. And those were the 3 major clusters that we saw. We also saw a small cluster of cases where Euroscepticism was expressed in relation to very, very particular national concerns. So we saw that in Cyprus, for example, there were particular concerns about the nature of the possibility of Turkish membership of the EU. And we also saw in Kosovo that there were particular concerns about Serbian entry to the EU, very specific national concerns that we couldn't generalize from. So if you like, it's kind of 3.5 clusters, but those are the 4 the basic issues that we saw, the 4 frames that we identified. The second question that we then looked at was, what's the relative effect of these different crises? How can we compare across the crises? And the first thing was we looked at the Eurozone crisis, and perhaps unsurprisingly, this had the biggest impact. It was quite clear that the Eurozone crisis generally had a much bigger impact than the other crises, and universally across nearly all the states that we looked at. So this was a salient issue for all states and for all parties expressing Euroscepticism. With the migration crisis, we found that it had a big effect in some states, and it was very interesting to us that particularly the post-communist states of Central and Eastern Europe, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia and Czech Republic stood out for us as being particularly impacted by the migration crisis. When we came to Brexit, however, we found there was a very limited impact on the other member states and the other states that we looked at. Bearing in mind, this was early on in the process of Brexit, but it seemed to us clear to us that although we were doing this from the UK, where Brexit seemed to have a big impact, that actually there was a very limited impact of the crisis overall. And then we started to think about, okay, what are the implications of these?
So thinking about the implications, and in particular, how they might relate to the latest crisis that Europe and the EU is facing over COVID-19. Well, one of the things that we found when looking at Brexit was the importance of distinguishing between the short term and the long term. Something that looked very, very important at the time that Britain was extracting itself from the EU might look very different in the future as a source of mobilization of Euroscepticism. And I think the same is true with COVID-19. I mean, in the early stages, it's very much been viewed through the lens of a public health crisis, and Eurosceptic critiques have focused on the EU's perceived inability to respond effectively to that crisis, for example, during the early stages of the vaccination rollout. However, in the longer term, I think that it's probably going to be more a source of Eurosceptic mobilization around the way the EU has tried to respond to the social and economic impacts of the pandemic crisis, in particular the coronavirus recovery fund. And I think here the kind of findings that we had about the mobilization of Euroscepticism around the Eurozone crisis is going to be an interesting model, because here I think the division is going to be in terms of how Eurosceptic discourses are articulated and the kind of frames that are used that Paul has talked about. I think the key difference here is going to be between those countries that are the contributors to that recovery fund and those countries that are the beneficiaries of that recovery fund. And in particular, if the contributors try to use that fund as a form of conditionality to try and impact upon the domestic politics of the countries that are the recipients, either the economic policy, as they did during the Eurozone crisis, or politically, as we're increasingly seeing through attempts to link EU funding through the recovery fund, but also more generally to concerns about so-called rule of law issues, rule of law conditionality. So I think that's how that issue is likely to play out. And that's where I think the findings that we had in our article on the impacts of crisis are going to be really useful going forward, and particularly when we're looking at the impact of COVID-19 on Euroscepticism.